Across the world, construction sites have turned into graveyards. Cranes have torn through city blocks. Scaffolds have snapped like matchsticks. Tunnels, bridges, and towers crumbling with men still inside. These are the accidents too brutal to forget. Every case, real. Every life, erased in seconds. And today, we descend 6 layers deeper, each more painful than the last. This is the most painful construction deaths ever. Case 1. Caterpillar, Mapleton, Illinois, 2022. Molten iron fall. It was Thursday morning, June 2nd, 2022, at Caterpillar's Mapleton Foundry, a huge industrial complex on the outskirts of Peoria, Illinois. From the outside, the plant looks like a fortress of corrugated steel, with tall stacks pumping out heat shimmer even in early summer. Inside, it is another world, a cathedral of fire and metal. Massive overhead cranes travel along rails. Workers in yellow vests and hard hats move between roaring furnaces. Every surface is covered in dark dust and iron scale. The air smells of hot metal and oil. Noise is constant, a deep rumble of fans, motors, and molten iron pouring into molds. In one corner of the melt floor sat the 11-foot-deep crucible, a giant open pot of molten iron glowing white-orange at more than 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than lava, hot enough to kill in an instant. On this day, 39-year-old Stephen Dierkes, a new hire just 9 days into the job, was tasked with taking a sample from that crucible. There were no continuous guardrails around its lip, only scattered sections of pipe barrier and open edges. No toe boards, no safety chains, no fall arrest lines anchored to the building's frame. Workers wore hard hats, gloves, and high-vis vests, but no harnesses clipped to independent anchors. Even the supervisor watching from a corner of the platform had only a hard hat and vest. Nothing to stop a fall or rescue a man. Dierkes approached the edge with a sampling rod. The heat radiating from the crucible hit like opening an oven door 1,000 times hotter. Your face burns just standing near it. He reached forward. A thin layer of slag dust lay on the deck. His boot slid. In that split second, he lost balance. A co-worker only a few feet away saw him teeter, shouted, and lunged to grab him, but there was no guardrail to brace against, nothing to hold on to. Dierkes toppled backward over the lip into the molten iron. Witnesses told OSHA later, "I tried to go over to him, but I couldn't help him." In less than a heartbeat, the man disappeared beneath the seething metal. The heat was so intense, it warped nearby steel and scorched the gloves of the co-worker who reached out. The supervisor froze. Others screamed. Alarms began to echo through the plant. Within minutes, a crane was rolled over the crucible. Hooks and a retrieval basket were lowered, but there was nothing left to recover except fragments fused with molten iron. OSHA's classification called it fatal fall into molten iron, but workers used another phrase, thermal annihilation. It means the body is destroyed in seconds, leaving nothing recognizable. After the incident, OSHA fined Caterpillar $145,027 for failing to provide fall protection at the poor deck. But no citation could undo the image burned into the eyes of the men on that floor. A new co-worker, gone in an instant, a family left without a father, and a job site where a guardrail or a harness anchored to something solid might have meant the difference between life and death. The tragedy at the Caterpillar Mapleton foundry became a haunting example of the dangers faced by workers in dangerous, high-risk environments. The death of Stephen Dierkes sparked an outrage across the country as workers and families demanded accountability for the systemic safety failures that led to this horrific accident. Case 2, Marathon Oil Tower, Houston 2020, stairwell collapse. It was just after 1:30 p.m. on Monday, October 5th, 2020, in the heat of a regular workday. 3 men, iron workers from a trusted subcontractor, were inside the 15-story Marathon Oil Tower under construction in Houston's Energy Corridor. The building's tall concrete frame loomed unfinished, wrapped in scaffolding and shadows. Inside, the stairwell shaft was dark, dusty, and echoing with every clang of steel. They were installing the stair system, massive prefabricated steel frames bolted to the concrete core. No full railings, no edge barriers, just skeleton stairs hanging over an empty vertical shaft from floor to floor, all the way down to the basement. The men wore standard PPE, hard hats, gloves, safety vests, and work boots. One wore a fall harness, but he had clipped it to the very frame of the stairwell itself. It was the only anchor point nearby, and that's when it failed. Without a sound, without a warning. The bolts gave out. It started at the top. A sudden crack, faint at first, like ice splitting under weight, then a violent whump as the topmost stair section dropped straight down. One floor after another, the entire staircase ripped loose like a zipper being torn through concrete. Steel slammed against steel. Frames snapped, twisted, and plummeted through the hollow shaft. Each fall sheared the next one loose. The workers didn't fall 10 feet. They fell dozens of feet, possibly over 100 feet, trapped inside collapsing steel. Their bodies slammed against metal beams, tossed like rag dolls in a steel avalanche. They didn't have time to scream. One man was pinned by a twisting staircase section, his spine likely crushed mid-air. Another slammed against the shaft wall, breaking every rib before being buried under mangled steel. Rescue teams arrived within minutes, but they could only look down into the dust-filled shaft. What they saw was haunting. Nothing looked like stairs anymore, just a metallic explosion of steel and blood. Bodies were trapped beneath entire sections of staircase. One man was still tangled in his harness, upside down, with the hook of his lanyard wrapped around a bent beam, his face crushed against concrete. There were no guardrails, no protective netting, no safety barriers, just a deep shaft lined with raw concrete. OSHA would later confirm the men were using the very structure they were building as their access point. There was no independent fall protection. Their only anchor points fell with them. One worker's family would later say he trusted the system. He thought the harness would save him. It didn't. All 3 workers died on the spot. Their bodies had to be recovered with specialized equipment. A crane was brought in to carefully lift out the twisted stair sections, one by one. Crews worked for hours just to find the victims inside the pile. And as steel was peeled away, first responders could see the reality. Helmets shattered, limbs broken in half, blood smeared across concrete. Each fall was like being thrown down an elevator shaft with no walls, but worse, because jagged steel followed them down, crushed them on impact, then buried them alive. Their names were eventually released. But inside that shaft, they died as builders, using their hands, their strength, their lives to raise someone else's skyscraper. The collapse claimed 3 lives and left another man hospitalized. Rescue teams stabilized the building, then used heavy cranes and cutting equipment, carefully lifting away concrete and steel, to recover the bodies over several days. Each stair segment weighed nearly 14,000 pounds, making the recovery painstaking and dangerous. Although sources named Alexander Grandas as one victim, the identities of the other 2 were withheld pending family notification. After the collapse, investigators from OSHA, structural engineers, the general contractor, Harvey Builders, and the developer, Marathon Oil, launched inquiries into design, erection procedures, and safety protocols. The building's remaining structure was assessed to be intact, allowing work to resume only when proper safety review and remediation were put in place. The tragedy became a stark warning across the Houston construction industry. When temporary systems are used for access, not just load, every connection, pin, brace, and anchor must be independent and fully secured, because the cost of failure is human lives. Case 3, Seattle Crane Collapse, Washington 2019, pins removed too early. Saturday, April 27, 2019, 3:28 p.m. South Lake Union, Seattle. The skies were clear over Seattle's tech district. The wind was steady. 2 tower cranes stood tall over Mercer Street, casting long shadows over the newly rising Google office building. One of them, a towering 278-foot machine, was already in the process of being dismantled. 2 ironworkers were perched high up on the crane mast, hundreds of feet above the city. The horizontal boom had already been taken down. What remained was the vertical spine of the crane, multiple steel sections stacked and pinned together, forming the body of the beast. But something was terribly wrong. As the crew began disassembling the mast, they removed far too many pins, too early. Some investigators later said more than 50 pins were missing, weakening multiple joints at once. Normally, sections are detached one at a time, each one carefully anchored to another crane before a single bolt comes out. But this time, whole rows of pins were gone without proper support. The crane was standing on false bones. And then the wind came. A gust clocked around 45 miles per hour swept through the corridor. It wasn't a storm, just a normal spring breeze. But for a 278-foot tower whose spine had been quietly hollowed out, it was enough. The upper mast began to twist. A groaning, grinding sound tore through the air as steel buckled in slow motion. Then, snap. The structure began to collapse, violently, vertically. 8 massive steel sections, each weighing nearly 7 tons, peeled away from the sky and crashed down. The 2 ironworkers stood no chance. They were tethered to the very pieces that broke away. As the mast fell, their safety harnesses dragged them down with it. One was believed to have been crushed and shredded instantly, body dismembered beneath mangled steel. The other was thrown through the air, his body likely smashed against glass, rebar, or concrete before the world went black. Then came the second horror. The heaviest parts of the crane, including the operator cab and machinery, detached and flew outward over Mercer Street. They slammed into traffic with a monstrous, earth-shaking crash. A black sedan was crushed like paper. Its roof folded into the seats. Glass exploded across the sidewalk. Inside that car sat 19-year-old Sarah Wong, a college student with her whole life ahead of her. A few feet away, another victim, 71-year-old Alan Justad, was caught in the collapse and killed instantly. The street turned into a death zone. Dust, smoke, blood, steel, and debris. People screamed. Drivers ran. Witnesses froze, trying to comprehend what they had just seen. A dashcam would later show the horrifying moment. A steel tower crumpling into the earth, slicing through the air like a blade. When rescue teams arrived, the area was unstable. Debris shifted. Steel was twisted. The bodies of the ironworkers were found under massive segments, their remains so mangled that initial recovery was delayed. The investigation was immediate and damning. Washington State's Department of Labor and Industries confirmed that the collapse was preventable. The crews had removed too many pins too early, violating manufacturer protocols and basic dismantling procedures. There was no margin for error, and the result was fatal. Fines were issued to multiple companies involved. But no price, no punishment, no apology could reverse what had happened on that clear Saturday afternoon. 4 lives were taken in an instant, 2 of them crushed while simply driving. 2 others fell with the very structure they trusted to hold them, and all because someone thought it was okay to cut corners, to pull the pins before the crane was ready to stand without them. Case 4, Philadelphia 22nd and Market, 2013. Demolition collapse. Wednesday, June 5, 2013, 10:41 a.m. Center City, Philadelphia. It was a bright mid-morning at the intersection of 22nd and Market Streets in one of the busiest parts of downtown Philadelphia. Traffic was humming. A red light blinked at the corner. Pedestrians were walking, sipping coffee. Delivery trucks idled. The sidewalks were alive. Across the street stood the Salvation Army thrift store, a small 1-story red brick building. It was just 65 feet long and 30 feet wide, quiet, unassuming, packed with morning shoppers. But right behind it stood something else, something unstable. A 4-story, 100-year-old building next door was in the process of being demolished. The contractor had stripped its interior walls, shattered the windows, and begun hammering at its sides. But instead of using proper demolition equipment, they were relying on small backhoes and workers with hand tools. The wrecking crew was cutting corners. There were no permits for machine work. There was no protective scaffolding, no support wall. The city's own inspections were rushed and poorly documented. And most damning of all, there were people inside the store, directly next to the wall they were tearing down. The north wall, a 3-story, 30-foot-wide brick face, stood exposed. Cracks zigzagged across it. Mortar dust drifted from the seams. It was a structure in slow-motion collapse, held together by hope and friction. And then, the inevitable. At 10:41 a.m., as the machine clawed the upper edge of the wall, the entire masonry section suddenly gave way. An estimated 400,000 pounds of brick, cinder block, wood, and steel broke loose and came crashing down, directly onto the Salvation Army store. Not a piece. The whole wall fell, top to bottom, straight down, like a guillotine of stone and death. The roof of the thrift store was crushed instantly. Support beams snapped, walls folded inward, and glass shattered with terrifying force. A thick cloud of brick dust choked the air, swallowing the entire block in a dense gray fog. Inside the store, people had no warning. There was no creaking, no alarm, just sudden, violent darkness. A 35-year-old woman named Anne Bryan was in the fitting room trying on clothes. She was buried alive, suffocated under a weight she never saw coming. A worker named Nadia Felton was helping a customer near the front counter. She was crushed, her body found later folded beneath wooden shelving and collapsed debris. One woman was pinned alive for over 13 hours, screaming in the dark, her legs mangled, her ribs shattered, trapped under beams that had to be slowly cut around her to extract what remained. 6 people died, 13 others were injured. Dozens of family members watched in agony as search crews combed through the rubble, brick by brick. The rescue was horrifying. Firefighters reported hearing faint cries under the debris. One woman's arm was visible, but her body was gone. A man's hand stuck out from under a slab, lifeless. Dogs barked, trained to detect breathing. Each time they paused, crews fell silent, hoping, listening. Some victims had their spines crushed. Others were unrecognizable. Faces torn by broken glass and twisted metal. Bricks had fallen in layers, tons at a time, smashing every air pocket, breaking bodies into silence. The demolition crew had not followed any engineering plan. The wall that killed them was supposed to come down after hours after a protective barrier had been erected. Instead, it was brought down by a backhoe operated by a man high on marijuana, working without proper supervision. The site contractor, Griffin Campbell, had ignored warnings from his own workers and from concerned citizens. Emails showed that city inspectors were aware of the risky setup, but no one intervened. One of the worst truths? The Salvation Army was warned. One email sent weeks earlier said the wall was unstable and that collapse was likely. But the store stayed open. No evacuation, no alerts, no closure. This wasn't a freak accident. It was a slow murder by negligence. The aftermath was chaos. Lawsuits flooded the courts. Victims' families called for criminal prosecution. The crane operator received 7.5 to 15 years in prison. The contractor got 15 to 30 years for involuntary manslaughter. The Salvation Army quietly settled, but never publicly apologized. Philadelphia changed its codes after that. But for the people buried under bricks and the families who stood outside that fence all day begging to hear names, change came far too late. Because when a 30-foot wall falls on your head, there's no time to escape. There's no second chance, only silence. Case 5. Raleigh, North Carolina, 2015, mass climber, scaffold failure. Monday, March 23, 2015, 11 a.m. South Harrington Street, downtown Raleigh. It was late morning in downtown Raleigh. The air was cool, the sidewalks alive with people walking to lunch. At the corner of South Harrington Street and Lenoir, a new 11-story glass and concrete tower, Charter Square, was rising, its unfinished skin revealing raw concrete and steel beams. Bolted to its side was a mast-climbing work platform, 35 feet of steel deck bolted onto 2 vertical masts, a machine that could hoist more than 4,000 pounds of men and materials up and down like a freight elevator. On that Monday morning, Jose Armando Hernandez, 41, Jose Erasmo Hernandez, 33, and Jesus Armando Martinez, 33, were standing on the platform. They were wearing hard hats, orange vests, steel-toed boots, and harnesses clipped to lifelines. But the lifelines were attached to the platform itself, the very thing holding them up. Their job was to reposition the scaffold to install the building's exterior panels. The mast climber creaked as it lowered. Dust from the building clung to their gloves. From the street below, onlookers saw a normal construction scene until, Without warning, the system failed. Witnesses heard a sharp metallic crack, like a rifle shot. One of the mast's tie-in brackets, the steel arms that anchor the mast into the building, had either come loose or never been properly secured. With a sickening groan, the right mast tilted away from the building, dragging the platform with it. For a heartbeat, everything hung suspended. Then the whole 35-foot platform tore free. It swung outward like a door being ripped off its hinges, then plummeted down 11 stories, over 120 feet, still carrying the 3 men and hundreds of pounds of tools. Because their harnesses were clipped to the platform, they were dragged down with it. They had no chance to unclip. They didn't even have time to scream. The impact on the pavement was catastrophic. The steel deck, weighing several tons, hit with a force that cracked the street. Planks and beams turned into spears, shooting across the sidewalk. 2 men were killed instantly, their bodies crushed beneath the twisted frame, helmets shattered. A third was found, pinned under mangled steel, still faintly breathing but dying before paramedics could cut him free. People in nearby buildings described a bomb-like sound. Dust and debris filled the air. Orange safety vests were soaked in blood. Tools lay scattered like shrapnel. A bystander said he saw one worker's arm, visible under the wreckage, motionless. Rescue crews arrived within minutes, but the scene was so unstable they couldn't lift the heavy steel by hand. Firefighters and medics used hydraulic cutters to peel away the wreckage section by section. Each time they moved a piece, a cascade of smaller debris slid down, and responders had to pause and re-stabilize the pile. They worked in silence, except for the hiss of tools and the occasional shout of a command. Investigators from OSHA and North Carolina's Department of Labor later pieced together what had gone wrong. The mast climber had not been properly tied into the building at all required points. Workers' harnesses were attached to the platform itself instead of an independent lifeline anchored to the building. No debris netting or secondary fall protection was in place. In other words, everything depended on the integrity of the platform. When it failed, so did their last line of defense. The 3 men who died were not reckless. They were doing their job on a machine they trusted. But on that day, the machine became a trap. In less than 3 seconds, they went from working in the sky to being crushed under tons of steel on the street. In the months that followed, fines and lawsuits were issued against the installer and the manufacturer. Safety advocates called the collapse a textbook example of why mast climbers, capable of lifting 4 tons, must be anchored correctly and workers tied off to something that will not fall with them. But for the families of Jose Armando, Jose Erasmo, and Jesus Armando, those lessons came too late. On a quiet Monday morning in downtown Raleigh, their workplace became their grave. Layer 2, Case 1, Sihanoukville, Cambodia, 2019, 7-story building collapse. June 22, 2019, Sihanoukville, Cambodia. It was still dark, 4 a.m., when the walls began to tremble. In the early morning silence, the only sounds around the Sihanoukville construction site were the whirring of ceiling fans in makeshift worker rooms, a distant truck engine, and footsteps of men returning from late-night shifts. Inside the half-finished 7-story structure, a skeleton of concrete columns, incomplete slabs, and exposed rebar. More than 70 workers were asleep on the very floors they were building. The building wasn't complete. In fact, it wasn't even safe. There were no occupancy permits, no formal approval, and no reinforcement checks on the slabs. But the construction company, run by a Chinese development group, was cutting corners to push the building up fast. Some workers were camped on the second and third floors, sleeping on plywood boards. Others laid thin mats on raw concrete. There were no safety exits, no alarms, no guardrails, and the building's center of gravity had become dangerously unstable. The concrete on the upper floors had been poured too quickly, without giving the lower floors time to fully cure. The structure was overloaded, and the steel reinforcement bars, too thin, poorly anchored, many were already rusting. Then the cracking began. Witnesses described hearing what sounded like bones snapping under pressure, loud pops and sharp cracks, followed by a deep, rumbling groan. Then came the scream of steel tearing apart, and suddenly the top collapsed inward. Like a zipper being pulled from the top down, floor after floor pancaked. The building imploded into itself, crushing each layer below. It took less than 10 seconds. Massive concrete slabs, each 12 inches thick and weighing several tons, dropped directly on the sleeping workers below. The force was unstoppable. Some were killed instantly, flattened beyond recognition. Others were pinned alive beneath jagged edges, their limbs crushed and trapped in twisted rebar. Screams echoed under the rubble. And then, silence. The collapse didn't just fall straight. Parts of the outer structure peeled outward, sending bricks, beams, and roofing sheets flying up to 50 feet in all directions. A nearby snack stall was destroyed. Dust engulfed the entire street. The neighboring building shook from the impact. Rescuers rushed in. But what they saw was a mangled graveyard. A cloud of concrete dust choked the air. Workers from nearby sites came running barefoot. Police and military were called in. No cranes were on standby. No rescue plans in place. They clawed through debris by hand at first, then jackhammers, then hacksaws, then bare hands again. But the concrete was too thick. Some victims were buried under slabs taller than the rescuers themselves. Others were crushed beyond recognition. Only an arm, a boot, or a piece of clothing visible. At one point, a rescue worker paused. He had found a man whose entire lower body was pinned under a slab. The man was still alive, eyes wide in terror. His legs, unrecognizable. He begged for help. His ribs were cracked. His mouth bled with every breath. But they couldn't pull him out. They couldn't even move the concrete above him. He died within minutes, whispering for his mother. By the end of the operation, which took more than 3 days, at least 28 people were confirmed dead, with dozens more seriously injured. Some survivors had limbs amputated at the scene to free them. Others were pulled out dead, with their bodies crushed so flat they could not be placed in coffins. The Cambodian Prime Minister called it murder through greed. Investigators found the building had no construction permit. Materials used were below standard. Reinforcement bars were misplaced or insufficient. The 7-story building became a 7-story coffin. The aftermath: 3 Chinese nationals were arrested. One, the owner, had attempted to flee the country, but accountability wasn't enough. For the families, the loss was irreversible. Fathers, brothers, husbands, all gone, not in a war zone, but under the very buildings they were promised would give them a better life. Case 2. PI Viaduct, Singapore, 2017, highway ramp collapse. July 14, 2017. It was just past 3:30 a.m. The sky still black over Singapore's busy Pan Island Expressway, PIE. Construction crews had been working through the night to raise a new flyover ramp in Changi. For most of the city, the early morning calm meant silence. But for the men on site, it was just another shift. Metal groaned. Machinery buzzed. Then, in a single breathless instant, everything gave way. The massive concrete structure, 40 meters long, over 11.8 meters wide, collapsed without warning. The viaduct they were standing on suddenly sank 11 meters straight down, crashing onto workers and equipment below. The sound was unlike anything heard before, a deep, echoing boom. Concrete slamming into concrete, steel screaming, the air splitting in half. And then silence. A deadly, choking silence. Moments earlier, 10 men were on top of the deck, setting steel reinforcement bars, tightening bolts, adjusting alignments. Most of them were migrant workers, men from China, India, and Bangladesh, who left home for wages that could feed a family back home. Among them was Cheng Jianxiong, 31, a father of two from China, known by co-workers as calm, focused, always safe. He never made it out alive. When the structure fell, Cheng was crushed instantly under the sheer weight of the viaduct. Others were thrown violently from the edge, their bodies hitting the ground like rag dolls. Concrete dust filled the air, choking those who tried to crawl to safety. Screams pierced the darkness, not just from pain, but disbelief. Some men were pinned, their legs shattered under steel rods. Others lay motionless, blood mixing with the wet cement underfoot. It took minutes for the first emergency sirens to arrive, but by then, bodies were already being pulled out from under broken scaffolding and twisted rebar. 4 workers were found with severe injuries: broken ribs, internal bleeding, head trauma. 1 man lost his arm. Another couldn't speak, his jaw shattered in the impact. But Cheng Jianxiong's body was discovered hours later beneath thousands of pounds of rubble. His helmet had split open. His spine had been crushed. The official cause of death: traumatic asphyxia. The weight of the slab had simply flattened him. Authorities soon confirmed what many feared: the ramp wasn't ready to hold itself up. The temporary supports, known as corbels and precast pierheads, had not been properly grouted or cured. That means the wet mortar between structural segments hadn't fully set. It should have taken at least 24 to 36 hours for the connections to harden. But instead, the builder, or Kim Piao contractors, had rushed the process, moving forward with work even before critical parts of the structure were stable. And as the weight increased, the incomplete joint sheared apart. The entire viaduct folded downward like a broken spine. Worse still, the contractor had a history. In 2015, they had already been convicted in another collapse, a similar case of cutting corners, ignoring safe procedures. That case left 1 dead. But they were still allowed to bid for government projects. 2 years later, it happened again, this time under national scrutiny. Photos from the site showed bent steel bars protruding from concrete, dust-coating blood-stained tools, hard hats lying untouched near the collapse zone. Investigators walked the site in horror. This wasn't just an engineering failure. It was a human disaster caused by pressure, shortcuts, and silence. In the days that followed, Singaporeans were stunned. A city known for precision, discipline, and safety had witnessed a collapse that felt avoidable. For the workers' families, grief turned to anger. 1 widow, too broken to speak, simply stood at the site days later, staring at the rubble as if trying to understand how a place her husband went to build became his grave. The final report was damning. The viaduct section weighed over 600 tons. The temporary support system had not been properly reviewed. Lack of communication between engineers, site supervisors, and workers was cited as a key failure. And most disturbing of all, the collapse occurred during ongoing work, with zero backup fall protection in place. Orkimpiao Contractors was later fined and blacklisted, and several staff members were charged under Singapore's Workplace Safety and Health Act. But for many, the punishment felt hollow. 1 dead, 10 injured, dozens of families scarred. The site was cleared. Construction resumed under a new team. But nothing could erase the images that morning left behind. The twisted steel, the stunned silence, the broken bones under the dust, and the question no one could answer. What if they had waited one more day for the concrete to set? One more day, and Chung might have come home. Case 3, Antwerp, Belgium, 2021. School site collapse. June 18, 2021, 12:30 p.m. A Friday afternoon in Nieuw-Zuid, a fast-growing suburb south of central Antwerp. The sun was out. The sky was calm. On the surface, it looked like a day of progress. A brand-new school building, still under construction, was rising fast, a symbol of hope for future generations. But deep inside the site, something wasn't right. There were 3 cranes towering above, scaffolding wrapped around unfinished walls, and freshly laid concrete floors with steel reinforcements just installed the day before. The site, run by Belgian construction giant Democo, was supposed to be structurally sound. Workers, many of them foreign subcontractors from Portugal and Romania, were scattered across several levels, laying bricks, welding, pouring concrete. Then it happened. Without a single warning, the entire southwest corner of the structure crumbled. A 40-meter section of scaffolding, brick walls, steel mesh, and wet concrete came crashing down 5 stories. What was once a stable frame of beams and brick collapsed in a cloud of dust and broken bodies. Men screamed. Bricks pelted from above like missiles. Concrete beams twisted like snapped bones. Scaffolding didn't just fall, it folded in on itself, dragging everything with it. The scene turned to hell in seconds. 5 workers were buried, some under more than 2 meters of rubble. 1 man was crushed between a falling scaffold and a steel beam. His spine snapped instantly. Another was thrown from the 4th floor to the concrete below, face first. His helmet split apart. Blood pooled beneath his head before his heart even stopped beating. Rescue teams rushed to the scene. Firefighters, paramedics, and K9 units swarmed the site. Diggers were brought in, so were drones, but the air was thick, full of concrete dust, heat, and screams from those still trapped. Survivors were pinned under twisted rebar, some screaming, others unable to speak, as they bled out in silence. It was like trying to pull bodies from a collapsed mine. 1 man was alive when they found him. He was face down, beneath a half-ton steel formwork panel, his leg bent behind his back at an unnatural angle. He tried to lift his head, he tried to speak, but his ribs had caved in, puncturing his lung. He suffocated in front of the firefighters, trying to save him. All they could do was cry. By nightfall, 20 workers had been injured. 5 never made it out alive. Their names were later released. All of them were subcontracted migrant laborers. None spoke fluent Dutch, and none were given clear evacuation plans or radios. So how did this happen? In the weeks before the collapse, photos surfaced online showing deep cracks in the structure's brickwork and scaffolding. Workers had complained. Some said the floors were vibrating under their feet, but the main contractor pushed on. Democo ignored the warnings. In their words, they were on a tight deadline. That meant pouring concrete before it was ready. That meant stacking scaffolding on unfinished floors. That meant risking lives for schedules. Investigators later confirmed it. The collapse was due to premature removal of structural supports. The concrete had not cured long enough, causing load transfer too early. Bracing on the scaffolding was inadequate, and the sequence of construction violated basic engineering logic. Worse still, the workers on site had no fall arrest harnesses, no secure anchor points. Some had helmets, most had gloves, but when the building gave way, no safety gear could have stopped what happened. Their bodies fell with the walls, defenseless, and the surroundings? The site sat just 50 meters away from a residential area. Children played outside, elderly neighbors watched from windows. Some residents heard the crash and thought it was an earthquake, but what they were hearing was a structure collapsing under its own weight, with men inside it. The school was never finished. The tragedy rocked Belgium. Politicians called for better regulations, but no executive was jailed. No manager was indicted. Democo issued a statement of regret. The site was cleared. A plaque was placed near the ruins. But the 5 workers, whose hands built the school, were buried in foreign soil. Their families were flown in for funerals. Some couldn't afford to travel. One wife sent a voice note asking if her husband had suffered. They didn't tell her the truth. He was still breathing when the wall landed on him. It took 10 minutes for him to die. And that's the story of a school that never opened, because the people building it were buried beneath it. Case 4. Grayston/M1 Bridge Collapse, Johannesburg, 2015. Temporary works collapse. October 14th, 2015. Time, 12:25 p.m. Location, M1 Highway, Sandton, Johannesburg's financial district. It was lunch hour and traffic was heavy. Over 20,000 vehicles pass beneath this stretch of road every day. But on that Wednesday, the highway turned into a graveyard. Above the cars, a pedestrian bridge was being built. It wasn't finished, not even close. Only temporary support structures were in place. Engineers call them temporary works. The scaffolding, props, and steel framework that holds a structure up before it becomes strong enough to hold itself. The bridge would connect Sandton to Alexandra Township, rich to poor, a symbol of unity. But by the end of that day, it would only symbolize pain. There were 2 massive horizontal steel girders, each about 36 meters long, held up by steel shoring towers on either side of the M1 highway. These were not yet permanently fixed. They were held in place by a combination of bolts, cross-bracing, and friction. Some called it stable, others called it dangerous. And then, just after noon, something gave way. No warning, no rumble, just sudden collapse. The entire temporary steel support system failed. In under 3 seconds, the massive steel girders plunged down like a guillotine, slamming onto the highway. One landed directly onto a white Toyota Corolla, crushing it flat, from roof to tires. The driver was still inside. The steel beam weighed over 85 tons. It hit with the force of a freight train. There was no chance. The woman inside was killed instantly. Her body sliced and crushed beyond recognition. Witnesses said her car looked like it had gone through a trash compactor. Glass, blood, bones, all fused in twisted metal. Rescue workers needed a blowtorch to remove her from the wreckage. Another steel section hit a pickup truck. The driver survived, but lost both legs. His passenger died from blunt force trauma to the chest, ribs broken inward, lungs punctured. Nearby, a cement truck swerved and flipped. The cabin caved in. The driver's skull split on impact. He died before paramedics arrived. In total, 2 people were killed. 19 others were injured, many with spinal and cranial trauma. Multiple cars were totaled. The bridge collapsed across all 6 lanes of the highway. The air turned grey with dust and panic. Drivers stumbled from their cars, screaming, bleeding, trying to call loved ones. One man crawled out of his vehicle with a broken arm and tried to lift the beam off another crushed car. He couldn't. No one could. The beam was still hot from the sun, searing the skin of those who touched it. Police sealed off the area. Helicopters circled above. The scene looked like a war zone. So what went wrong? A commission of inquiry later found the temporary support system was not adequately designed or tested. The shoring towers were not anchored securely. There was no lateral bracing to prevent collapse from wind or vibration. The steel sections may have been under too much torsional stress. And worst of all, there was no traffic diversion beneath the site during critical construction hours. In other words, they let cars drive under a bridge that wasn't stable. The contractor, Murray and Roberts, maintained that the collapse was a mystery. But engineering experts pointed to gross negligence in temporary works planning. The design was flawed. The supervision was inadequate. The inspection was rushed. The site itself, it was tight and uneven, sitting between the elevated Greyston Drive and the fast-moving M1 below. There was no crash barrier, no netting, just steel, bolts, and gravity. A disaster waiting to happen. Survivors reported hearing metallic groans days before the collapse. Workers raised concerns. They said the steel structure felt loose and shaky in the wind. Nothing was done. No extra checks, no emergency reinforcement. That day, one of the girders tilted just a few degrees after a passing truck's vibration. That's all it took. The angle shifted, the bracing snapped, the load shifted, and down it came. And the aftermath? Families left without parents, children orphaned, a mother buried in pieces, a father who would never walk again. 2 lives ended under a bridge that was supposed to bring people together. And like many cases of construction failure, no one truly paid the price. The bridge was never completed, and in Santon, even now, drivers still glance up when they pass under construction, wondering if the next beam might fall, because once you've seen steel fall from the sky, you don't forget the sound it makes. Case 5, Thane, India, 2023, girder launcher collapse. August 1st, 2023, Maharashtra, India. It was past midnight, but the work hadn't stopped. Crews were racing to finish Package 14 of the Samruddhi Expressway project, an ambitious, multi-billion-dollar superhighway meant to connect Mumbai to Nagpur. Every deadline mattered. Every shift pushed deep into the night. The pressure was enormous. Above a quiet stretch of land near the Salambe village, workers were installing box girders, giant, hollow steel beams, on top of massive concrete piers. These girders would form the base of the flyover bridge. But to place them, you need something colossal. A launching gantry, also called a girder launcher, a crane-like machine that slides huge beams into place between columns. This launcher, 90 feet tall, over 700 tons in weight, 2 pylons, multiple hydraulic jacks, precision engineered to move inch by inch, or at least it was supposed to be. That night, it went horribly, fatally wrong. At 12:32 a.m., the launcher was moving a prefabricated girder across the columns when suddenly, the entire machine gave way. First came the screeching, a horrible, metallic scream. Then, silence. Then, collapse. The girder launcher snapped at one of its support beams. The huge structure tilted, then dropped like an iron slab, crashing straight onto the workers below. One massive girder slammed down across a makeshift shelter where several workers had taken a short break after helping guide the previous segment. Another steel segment fell from the launcher itself, cutting through the night like a blade. The noise was deafening. The impact shattered windows in nearby homes. The earth shook. 20 workers were caught underneath. 17 died on the spot. Their bodies crushed, shredded, unrecognizable. Some were split in half, others pinned under twisted scaffolding and hydraulic jacks. Blood seeped into the gravel. One man's body was found with both legs torn from his torso, 8 feet apart. Another, a 22-year-old father from Bihar, was flattened under the girder, his chest compressed to just 5 inches. A worker who ran to help vomited when he saw what was left of him. The rescue was a nightmare. Fire services arrived with cranes, but even the biggest machines struggled to lift the launcher. It was still attached to pieces of the column, twisted like spaghetti. Oxygen tanks were rushed in, but it was too late for almost everyone. By 5 a.m., only 3 bodies had been fully recovered. The others, pulled out in parts, skulls, torsos, limbs, over the next 24 hours. Nearby, villagers watched in horror, clutching their children, listening to the screams echoing from under the steel. So how did this happen? Early reports showed the launcher's support pins may have been removed prematurely, the hydraulic balancing system failed under load, the temporary bearings were not properly locked, there was no redundant failsafe. Most damning, the crew had been working beneath the active launching gantry, a massive violation of safety protocols. There were no exclusion zones, no barricades, no emergency fall protection. Even basic PPE was inconsistent. Some wore helmets, others didn't. There were no harnesses because workers weren't expected to fall, but no one expected the sky to fall on them either. At the base of the structure, no safety officer was on duty. The shift supervisor, overwhelmed, was later found crying on site. They were like brothers, he told reporters. I told them we could finish this one girder and rest. I told them we were almost done. 17 funerals happened in the next 2 days. Most victims were migrant laborers from Bihar, Jharkhand, and West Bengal, men who had come hundreds of miles for work. Their families never got to say goodbye. In the aftermath, the project was paused. Investigations were launched. News channels showed bloodied shoes, severed hands, and prayer beads pulled from under wreckage. Officials promised full accountability, but no one could account for the lives lost. The launcher, now a twisted metal carcass, was eventually dismantled. The stretch of road where the collapse happened is still nicknamed by locals the Bridge of Ghosts, because they say, you don't walk under the sky here without hearing the cries. Layer 3, Case 1, Bumblebee Plant, California, 2012, The Tuna Oven Tragedy. October 11th, 2012, Santa Fe Springs, California. The shift had just begun at the Bumblebee Foods tuna processing plant, a cavernous factory where the air smelled of brine, machinery roared, and workers moved in rhythm with the endless demand for canned fish. Among them was 62-year-old Jose Melena, a man who had spent years in this place, showing up early, doing his work quietly, never causing trouble. To his family, he was a provider. To his co-workers, he was reliable. That morning, Jose was assigned to work with the plant's most intimidating piece of equipment, a 35-foot-long industrial oven, a steel chamber the size of a bus, designed to sterilize thousands of cans at once. When in operation, it reached 270 degrees Fahrenheit, 132 degrees Celsius, filling with scalding steam under immense pressure. Everyone knew the danger of those ovens, but like many who worked beside them daily, Jose had grown accustomed to their presence. Shortly after he began his task of loading carts stacked with tuna cans, something went fatally wrong. While Jose was still inside the oven's chamber area, a co-worker, believing he had already stepped out, sealed the heavy steel door and started the cycle. The locking mechanism clamped shut with a metallic thud. There was no warning system, no electronic sensor, no double-check procedure. Jose was trapped. Inside, the oven was pitch black, the walls beginning to sweat as steam poured in. Within minutes, the temperature surged past the boiling point of water. The pressure climbed higher and higher, the air turning unbreathable. There was no escape hatch, no emergency release. The oven was designed to be airtight, inescapable by design, perfect for sterilizing metal cans, fatal for a living man. For 2 full hours, the machine ran its cycle. The roar of the steam system drowned out any sound from within. Outside, workers carried on with their shifts, completely unaware. And when the oven door was finally opened, expecting racks of finished product, Jose's body was discovered among the carts. The horror was so shocking that some workers screamed and ran from the chamber. The tragedy made headlines around the world. A man cooked alive inside a tuna oven. Even seasoned investigators called it one of the most gruesome workplace accidents they had ever seen. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office launched an investigation, and what they found was devastating. Bumblebee Foods had no safety protocols to prevent such a disaster. There was no system requiring workers to confirm a chamber was empty before locking it. No alarms, no sensors, no safeguards, only routine and assumption. Regulators concluded that Jose's death was not just tragic, but completely preventable. For his family, no settlement could ever erase the horror. His sons spoke of the years of sacrifice his father had made to support them, only to die in such a barbaric way. The plant itself was scarred. Workers who remained said they could never look at the ovens the same way again. Some refused assignments near them. One employee admitted that every time he heard the clang of the steel door, he imagined Jose inside. The story struck a raw nerve nationwide, sparking debates about hidden dangers in America's food industry. If a man could die this way, in one of the nation's largest tuna plants, what other risks lurked in factories churning out the food people trusted every day? Case 2. Saint Laurent, Montreal, 2016. Death by rollers. August 8, 2016. Inside a plastics packaging plant in Saint Laurent, Montreal, production was running at full tilt. The extrusion lines filled the air with constant vibration, huge steel rollers spinning at breakneck speed, pulling and flattening sheets of plastic non-stop. To outsiders, they might look harmless, like giant rolling pins, but to those who worked there, they were predators in disguise. Once they caught something, they did not let go. The worker that day was a 56-year-old assistant operator stationed near line 4. It wasn't unusual for the machines to jam, and workers were often expected to climb ladders, lean in, and clear problems by hand, without shutting the line down. It was part of the culture. Get it fixed fast, keep production going, don't fall behind schedule. The man climbed a short ladder, leaned toward the rollers, and reached in. The machines spun faster than the human eye could track. hundreds of revolutions a minute, strong enough to crush plastic into sheets thinner than paper. In that instant, his sleeve brushed the surface. That was all it took. The rollers grabbed him like a set of gears and ripped him forward with unstoppable force. There was no chance to fight back. His entire upper body was pulled into the nip point, crushed between the spinning cylinders before anyone could react. Workers screamed, lunging for the emergency stop, but the nearest button was meters away. By the time the system halted, the man had been fatally trapped. The floor went silent. His co-workers, men and women who had worked shoulder to shoulder with him for years, stood frozen, realizing they had just witnessed the kind of accident that safety manuals always warn about, but people secretly believe will never happen. The CNESST investigation later confirmed what everyone on that floor already knew. The machine should never have been accessible in the first place. The rollers lacked physical guarding to keep workers out of danger. The e-stops were placed too far from where operators actually worked, and the plant's procedures allowed, even normalized, the idea of clearing jams on live machinery. Inspectors immediately shut down and sealed the line. Production didn't resume until fixed barriers were installed and emergency stops were positioned where operators could actually reach them. Their report was blunt. This was a preventable death. But for the family, prevention came too late. A father, a co-worker, a friend, gone in seconds because a shortcut became routine. His death turned into a haunting lesson across Quebec. When machines run fast enough to turn plastic pellets into finished product, they can turn a man's body into nothing more than another jammed piece of material. Case 3, Michigan Seamless Tube, South Lyon, Michigan. Death in the acid vat. February 9th, 2019. South Lyon, Michigan. Inside the Michigan Seamless Tube plant, the air was thick with the stench of sulfur and metal. The facility specialized in making steel tubes for heavy industry, and at the heart of the process sat a row of open sulfuric acid vats. Each tank stretched more than 40 feet long and several feet deep, enough liquid to swallow a man whole. The contents were heated to nearly 160 degrees Fahrenheit, constantly steaming, constantly eating away at anything unlucky enough to fall inside. For workers, crossing the catwalks above the vats was part of daily life. The walkways were narrow strips of grated steel, slick from condensation and acid mist. Handrails lined some parts, but there were gaps, blind spots, and areas where a single slip meant nothing but air between your body and the boiling chemical below. It was a design that felt more like a gamble than a safeguard. Daniel Hill, 54 years old, was a long-time employee. That morning, he stepped onto one of those walkways to check the vats. He had done it countless times before, but this time, his foot slid. Maybe it was a patch of moisture, maybe a misstep. No one can say. What everyone agrees on is that in a fraction of a second, he lost his balance and toppled forward. The fall was only a few feet, but it may as well have been off a cliff. He plunged straight into the open vat. The surface of the acid erupted, hissing and spitting like a living thing. The heat was immediate, the burn absolute. Co-workers standing nearby froze in shock before rushing to help, grabbing poles and hooks, desperate to drag him out. They hauled him from the tank within seconds, but sulfuric acid is relentless. It doesn't stop burning when you're removed. It clings, it seeps, it destroys layer after layer of flesh. Emergency showers were triggered, water flooding over his body, but the damage was catastrophic. Paramedics rushed him to the University of Michigan Hospital, But even the best burn specialists could do little. The acid had already gone deep. Daniel Hill died that night, his body unable to fight the chemical devastation. The state investigation revealed what insiders had long suspected. The vats were left uncovered, guardrails were incomplete, and safety standards had been ignored. The fine was just $32,500, a number that felt insulting compared to the scale of the tragedy. For the men and women who worked beside him, the image would never fade. A single slip, a few feet of open space, and a boiling pool of sulfuric acid, enough to end a life in seconds. Case 4, East Texas Sawmill, 1983, Death by Whiplash Cable. East Texas, summer of 1983. The air was thick with sawdust and heat. Inside the East Texas sawmill, giant logs rolled down the conveyor lines. Loud machines roared and screamed as they cut through solid wood. The rhythm of work was rough, but normal. Men shouted instructions over the noise. Forklifts beeped, steel groaned. Everyone knew the job was dangerous, but they also knew the routine. In one corner of the mill, a heavy-duty cable line was stretched tight. So tight you could hear it hum. This wasn't just any cable. It was a thick steel wire rope, used to pull debris and wood chips out from the main processing area. Every few hours, someone had to manually feed logs into place, unjam the chipper, or adjust the tension. That day, something was off. Workers had noticed the cable looked a little worn. Not broken, but strained. It had been used for months, maybe longer, without being replaced. No one sounded the alarm. After all, it had held so far. Around mid-morning, 4 men were assigned to clear the chip line. One of them, a seasoned worker in his 40s, walked directly into the danger zone. The others followed with crowbars and wrenches. They needed to loosen a jam that had stopped the entire line. The logs had piled up, and the tension on the cable grew tighter and tighter, like a bow pulled back with too much force. Nobody saw it coming. Suddenly, with no warning, no sound, not even a creak, the cable snapped. But it didn't just fall, it whipped. The break happened in an instant, but the aftermath was brutal. The steel cable, now flying free, recoiled like a giant whip. It moved faster than the blink of an eye. The force was violent, merciless, and blind. It lashed across the work area, cutting through the air with a sharp, high-pitched scream. The first man was hit directly in the chest. His body lifted off the ground, thrown backwards several feet. The second man had his head struck cleanly, killing him on impact. A third was almost torn in half at the waist. The fourth tried to duck, but the cable wrapped around his leg, ripping muscle and bone as it yanked him off his feet. All 4 men were killed. They didn't die slowly. They didn't even have time to understand what happened. The speed and force of the snap were equal to a gunshot, but it hit 4 targets in one sweep. When emergency teams arrived, they found a scene soaked in blood, clothes torn apart, boots left standing where bodies had fallen. Pieces of the cable were embedded in the walls and floor. One section of metal was later measured at over 200 feet of travel in under a second. That's how hard and fast it whipped. It took days to clean the area. Some workers never came back. Others spoke of nightmares, the sound of the snap, the blur of movement, the horrible silence that followed. In the aftermath, questions were raised. Why hadn't the cable been replaced? Why weren't there guards or shields? Was there a maintenance log? Answers were slow and full of excuses. But to the families, it didn't matter. 4 men went to work that day. None went home. Killed not by fire, not by machine failure, but by a cable snapping like a rattlesnake strike. How many other cables, stretched beyond their limit, are waiting right now, in silence, for the moment they snap? Case 5. Tina's Burritos, Vernon, California, 2025. Death on the night shift. July 13th, 2025. Vernon, California, a city of factories, smoke, and steel. At night, the industrial district turns into a ghost town. Empty streets, humming neon, and warehouses that never truly sleep. Inside one of them, Tina's Burritos plant was quiet on the surface. The production lines had stopped, but the graveyard crew, the sanitation shift, was just beginning their work. Sanitation is the forgotten shift in food plants. The machines are supposed to be dead, powered down, harmless, but they are also open, exposed, and waiting. Workers climb inside kettles, scrub conveyor belts, spray down vats, sometimes with only a flashlight and a hose to guide them. It is a shift where one missing lock, one live wire, can turn cleaning into a fight for survival. Juan was only 19 years old, just weeks into the job. That night, around 9:30 p.m., he was assigned to clean one of the massive stainless steel processing machines. Some called it a grinder, others said it was a kettle, but to Juan, it was a monster. A steel tank big enough to swallow a man, with heavy blades and augers that churned food at industrial speed. He climbed up, leaned in, and began scrubbing the slick metal walls. Then it happened. Without warning, the machine roared back to life. The floor shook, the walls rattled, and the whine of steel filled the air. It was so sudden, so violent, that no one could believe it. One moment, it was silent. The next, it was awake, spinning, grinding, pulling. Juan never had a chance. In seconds, he was caught in the motion. His body was dragged inside as the blades turned. Co-workers screamed and sprinted across the wet floor, slamming their fists against the emergency stop. The red button went down with a crack, but the machine didn't stop instantly. Heavy steel has momentum. It spun down slowly, grinding, resisting, while seconds stretched into eternity. By the time it stopped, Juan was gone. The plant floor fell silent. The other young workers stood frozen, trembling, some collapsing to their knees. The smell of chemicals mixed with bloodless metallic heat hung in the air. When police and paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. Juan was pronounced dead at the scene. Cal OSHA moved fast, sealing the machine, opening an investigation. They wanted to know why lockout/tagout, the most basic protection in industrial cleaning, had failed. Why had a teenager been assigned to clean such a machine without direct supervision? Why had the system carried live power when it should have been cold and silent? For Juan's family, the news shattered their lives. He was only 19, a son who left home that night with a lunchbox and a smile, never to return. They would bury him with questions unanswered, while the investigation stretched on. For workers across California, it was another bitter reminder of what they already knew. Sanitation is the deadliest shift in food plants. Machines don't forgive. They don't care if you're 19 or 59. If they wake up while you're inside, you don't walk out. Layer 4, Case 1. BP Texas City Refinery, USA, 2005, the day the sky exploded. BP's Texas City Refinery was a giant, producing over 470,000 barrels of oil a day. At its core sat the raffinate splitter tower in the ISOM unit, a steel column over 170 feet tall, designed to handle volatile hydrocarbons. The unit had been shut down for maintenance, and operators were told to restart it. A routine procedure, but one every veteran knew was loaded with danger. That morning, the restart began badly. Gauges stuck, alarms failed, and operators relied on outdated instruments that hadn't worked properly in years. Temporary office trailers had been parked just yards away from the unit, filled with contractors, engineers, and managers. They were sitting in the direct blast zone, though few realized it. By noon, the tower was a ticking bomb. Instead of carefully controlled flows, the tower was overfilled with more than 200,000 gallons of flammable hydrocarbons, nearly 20 times the safe limit. Operators, misled by faulty readings, opened the wrong valves. Hydrocarbon liquid surged into the blowdown drum, which had no flare system to burn it off. Instead, it vented directly into the atmosphere, an invisible cloud of fuel hanging over the plant like a shroud. At 1:20 p.m., the vapor found a spark. The explosion was instant and biblical. A fireball ripped through the sky, equivalent to 1.5 tons of TNT, flattening everything nearby. The blast wave tore through the trailers, reducing them to twisted rubble in milliseconds. 15 workers were killed where they sat, many never even realizing what had happened. Another 180 across the site were injured, some thrown to the ground by the force, others burned as flames roared through the unit. For miles around, windows shattered. The ground shook like an earthquake. Residents described it as a bomb, a shockwave that rattled houses more than 10 miles away. Above Texas City, a towering plume of black smoke rose higher than 200 feet, visible for 30 miles in every direction. The aftermath was damning. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board launched its largest ever investigation. Their report read like an indictment. Outdated equipment, ignored warnings, broken alarms, disabled safety systems, and corporate culture that valued cost-cutting over human lives. BP had cut corners for years, saving money at the expense of safety. The trailers where workers died had been deliberately placed in a known hazard zone, a decision that made the death toll inevitable. BP paid more than $1.6 billion in settlements and a $50 million criminal fine, the largest OSHA penalty in history at the time. But no dollar figure could erase the horror. Families buried loved ones, co-workers lived with scars, and Texas City added another entry to its long, tragic record of industrial disaster. For the industry, the Texas City explosion became a textbook case, proof that one neglected tower, one broken gauge, one culture of cost-cutting could kill dozens and maim hundreds. Case 2. Tianjin Port, China, 2015. Fireballs over the city. August 12, 2015, Tianjin, China. The port never slept. Ships unloading chemicals, trucks rumbling through the night, and warehouses stacked to the roof with dangerous cargo. But in Warehouse 41, owned by Ruihai Logistics, the danger wasn't just routine. It was catastrophic. Inside, 800 tons of ammonium nitrate, 700 tons of sodium cyanide, and hundreds of tons of calcium carbide and potassium nitrate were packed together like kindling, stacked illegally, stored too close to one another, and located less than a kilometer from residential apartments. On paper, it was safe. In reality, it was a bomb waiting for a spark. At 10:50 p.m., workers saw smoke rising. Firefighters arrived within minutes, most of them young recruits, many barely in their 20s. They had no idea what was inside. Their supervisors hadn't been told. They dragged hoses toward the flames and opened water. It was a fatal mistake. water struck the calcium carbide, releasing acetylene gas, a fuel so volatile it only needed the faintest ignition. The first blast came without warning. At 11:34 p.m., a shockwave equivalent to 3 tons of TNT ripped through the port. Firefighters were thrown off their feet. Apartment windows shattered across the city. Families in nearby towers grabbed their children, running for stairwells as dust rained down. Many thought it was an earthquake. Others believed it was war. But then came the second explosion. 30 seconds later, 21 tons of TNT's worth of force detonated. A fireball the size of a skyscraper rose into the air, lighting up the night sky. Flames climbed more than 300 meters high, bright enough to be seen from orbit. The sound rolled across the city like rolling thunder, shaking buildings 20 kilometers away. At ground zero, the Ruihai warehouse simply vanished. In its place was a crater 300 feet wide and 60 feet deep, a wound carved into the earth. The human toll was devastating. 173 people were killed. More than 100 of them were firefighters, men who had rushed in with nothing but water hoses against chemicals that should never have been there. Thousands were injured. Over 17,000 homes were damaged, 8,000 cars destroyed, and 300 buildings wrecked. Families in the nearby apartment blocks stumbled through rubble, bloodied and dazed, as aftershocks from smaller blasts rattled windows and shook walls. When dawn came, Tianjin looked like a war zone. Charred shipping containers lay scattered like toys. Cars burned in endless rows, their paint peeled off by heat. The crater smoked like a volcano, surrounded by scorched earth. Parents searched for missing children in the rubble. Survivors carried bags of belongings, fleeing an area that looked more like Hiroshima than a port. The investigation uncovered systemic corruption. Ruihai Logistics had falsified permits, bribed officials, and concealed chemical inventories. The warehouse should never have been there. It violated zoning laws by being so close to residential neighborhoods. Dozens of executives and government officials were arrested. 49 were disciplined, and Ruihai's owners were sentenced to prison. Damages surpassed $1 billion, but no fine could erase the trauma. For China, the Tianjin blasts were a national wound, broadcast around the world in terrifying cell phone videos. They showed not just a chemical disaster, but the cost of greed, negligence, and corruption. If one warehouse could erase a city block with a crater visible from space, how many other hidden stockpiles of ammonium nitrate lie waiting in the shadows of the world's ports and cities? Case 3, Beirut Port Explosion, 2020. Beirut, Lebanon, August 4th, 2020. Just after 6 p.m., a small column of smoke began to rise over the city's port. At first, it looked like any other fire, an accident in a warehouse storing paint, fireworks, maybe chemicals. Crowds gathered on nearby streets, filming the smoke from their balconies, from cars, from rooftops. Mothers held their children close, but didn't leave. They thought it would be just another blaze, but in truth, they were minutes away from one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. Inside Warehouse 12, firefighters had rushed in with hoses and helmets, unaware of what lay stacked in the corner. For 7 years, 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, the same compound that had caused disasters in Texas City, 1947, and Toulouse, 2001, sat piled in decrepit storage. Reports, warnings, pleas from customs and security agencies had been ignored again and again. Officials knew. They signed papers, they filed memos, but no one moved it. And so, On that summer evening, a team of first responders entered a death trap without knowing it. The first minutes were confusing. Crackling noises filled the air. Fireworks going off from the fire. Tiny pops echoing into the city. Residents pulled out their phones. Some laughed nervously at the sight of sparks bursting out of the smoke column. Others whispered, "That doesn't look right." And then, a blinding flash. A first explosion ripped upward, sending people ducking. But the real nightmare had not yet begun. Seconds later, the ammonium nitrate ignited. In an instant, a fireball tore through the warehouse, unleashing the force of 1,100 tons of TNT. The blast flattened the port, creating a 460-foot-wide crater deep enough to swallow entire trucks. A red-orange cloud of nitrogen dioxide billowed skyward, glowing like something from a nuclear test site. The shockwave raced through the city at supersonic speed, shattering glass up to 6 miles away, ripping doors off hinges, collapsing ceilings onto families eating dinner. People filming from their balconies were thrown backward as glass shards cut across their faces. Cars on highways were lifted and flipped. Entire buildings crumbled as if made of sand. The roar of the explosion was so loud it was heard in Cyprus, 150 miles across the sea. In a single heartbeat, Beirut was turned into a war zone without warning. Across the city, hospitals were overwhelmed within minutes. The injured staggered through the streets, faces covered in blood, bodies pierced by flying glass. Some carried children limp in their arms, begging strangers for help. By the end, the toll was staggering. 218 people dead, over 7,000 injured, and more than 300,000 left homeless. Beirut's port, its economic lifeline, was destroyed. Entire neighborhoods looked like they had been bombed from the air. Families wandered rubble, calling out names, searching for loved ones. In one apartment block, a mother died, shielding her son with her own body. In another, a groom was killed just days before his wedding. And then came the fury. The Lebanese people learned the truth, that this wasn't a freak accident. It was criminal negligence. For years, officials had known about the ammonium nitrate, documented it, debated it, and ignored it. The explosion became not just a physical catastrophe, but a symbol of corruption, rotting the state from within. Protests erupted across Beirut, citizens storming ministries, demanding resignations. Some port officials and customs officers were arrested, but families of the victims say true justice has never come. The blast shattered not just glass, but trust in a government already on the brink. Beirut would never be the same again. The crater at the port still sits as a scar, a reminder of what happens when warnings are ignored, when negligence festers, and when a city is left defenseless against its own leaders' failures. And yet this was not the first, nor the last, time ammonium nitrate stockpiles would turn into a bomb in waiting. In another city, across another border, a fuel depot fire would erupt into an inferno just as terrifying. Case 4. Qingdao Oil Pipeline Blast, 2013. November 22, 2013. Qingdao, China, a bustling port city with factories, refineries, and neighborhoods stacked tightly together. Beneath its streets ran a network of pipes that carried crude oil, gas, and sewage. Most people walking those streets that morning had no idea they were living on top of a ticking time bomb. The pipeline in question was an old Sinopec crude oil line laid back in 1986, carrying thousands of barrels a day. Early that morning, residents began to notice a sharp, oily stench seeping up from drains. By mid-morning, work crews were called in. They cordoned off part of the road, broke into the ground, and began repairs. But what they didn't realize was that the leak had already spread far beyond the break. Oil had seeped through the soil, into the drainage network, into underground passages, saturating the air itself. Entire blocks of the city were quietly filling with invisible fuel vapors. At 10:30 a.m., the silence snapped. A spark, no one ever confirmed from where, touched off the vapors. The first blast ripped through the ground like a bomb under the pavement. Asphalt heaved upward. Cars bounced into the air before slamming back down. Manholes shot into the sky like missiles. A fireball punched through the street. And then, seconds later, a second explosion thundered through the drainage system, multiplying the destruction. The blast radius tore open a crater over 150 feet long and dozens of feet deep, swallowing cars and trucks whole. Flames burst from sewer grates blocks away as oil-soaked drains carried fire like veins across the city. Residents screamed as glass shattered in apartment towers, cutting anyone near a window. Witnesses described the sound like an earthquake mixed with a bomb. The shockwave rippled so hard through the city that buildings shook miles away. Pedestrians walking to work were hurled to the ground. Drivers caught mid-intersection were burned alive when fire raced under their vehicles and erupted upward. One bus was thrown sideways, trapping passengers until rescuers clawed them out. Workers repairing the pipeline were obliterated where they stood. A crew that never had the faintest chance to survive. By the time the fire was beaten back hours later, the damage was staggering. Over 60 people were dead and nearly 130 injured, many with life-altering burns. Entire city blocks were blackened ruins. The smell of crude oil and scorched earth lingered for days. Families gathered near the site, searching desperately for loved ones, while body after body was pulled from the rubble. The investigation that followed tore into China's industrial machine. Authorities revealed that corrosion, poor mapping of underground networks, and reckless repair practices had turned Qingdao into a death trap. Sinopec, one of the world's biggest oil firms, admitted responsibility. 9 people were detained. Dozens of managers and officials were punished, and the blast became a grim symbol of what happens when rapid industrial growth outpaces safety. For the people of Qingdao, though, punishments didn't erase the trauma. Mothers buried children. Workers never came home. And a city that prided itself on modern progress discovered the true cost of the pipelines buried beneath its streets. Case 5. Hangzhou Metro Tunnel Collapse, 2008. November 15, 2008. Hangzhou, China, a city of more than 6 million, famous for its Westlake and its booming modern skyline. Beneath those crowded streets, workers were carving a new future. The Hangzhou Metro, a subway system meant to rival Shanghai's. But that morning, as commuters rushed through the city above, a hidden nightmare was building underground. At one of the construction sites, crews were boring and reinforcing a new tunnel. It was supposed to be routine, but signs of trouble had already been brewing. Soft soil conditions, water seepage, and mounting pressure against retaining walls. Workers on the ground noticed cracks forming. Some even whispered their concerns. The soil was shifting, the supports groaning. But deadlines were tight, and the warnings went unheeded. Around 3:30 p.m., the tunnel finally gave way. The ground above buckled and then collapsed with a roar, swallowing everything in sight. A massive sinkhole opened across 75 yards of roadway. Entire sections of asphalt vanished into the void. Cars were pulled in as though by a giant hand, crushed and buried under tons of soil and concrete. Passers-by screamed as the earth beneath their feet crumbled. In seconds, a bustling street transformed into a chasm of twisted rebar, shattered vehicles, and choking dust. Inside the tunnel, chaos was worse. Workers were trapped in collapsing chambers, their shouts swallowed by the roar of falling soil. Reinforcement beams snapped like matchsticks. Some managed to scramble out, covered in dust and blood. Others were buried alive as concrete walls folded inward. Rescue teams rushed to the scene, but the danger wasn't over. The ground was still shifting, still hungry. As excavators clawed at the wreckage, more earth caved in, threatening to bury the rescuers themselves. Survivors who made it out told of running in pitch darkness, water rushing in, and the sound of co-workers screaming before silence fell. The official toll reported at least 21 dead and 24 injured, a figure that shocked the nation. Cars and buses had been swallowed whole, their occupants vanishing without a trace. Families gathered at the edges of the sinkhole, some screaming names into the dust, others waiting silently, knowing no one would come back. Authorities later admitted what many suspected: the soil conditions were unstable, the reinforcement inadequate, and safety had been sacrificed for speed. In the weeks that followed, the yawning crater remained, a scar in the city's heart. Thousands came to see it, some out of grief, others out of fear. It was a reminder that beneath the march of progress lay risks as deadly as any war zone. Layer 5, Case 1, Mecca Grand Mosque, Crane Collapse. September 11, 2015. Mecca, Saudi Arabia. The Grand Mosque, the holiest place in Islam, was alive with prayer. Thousands circled the Kaaba, voices rising in unison, unaware that above them, the storm clouds were gathering. By late afternoon, the skies turned black. Lightning forked across the horizon. Thunder shook the minarets. Winds howled at more than 50 miles per hour, and sheets of rain pounded the polished marble floor until it became a mirror of water. Towering over this sacred ground stood a monstrous crawler crane, nearly 650 feet tall, with a steel boom longer than a football field. It weighed hundreds of tons, planted into the earth like a skyscraper made of iron. It had been erected by the Bin Laden Group, one of Saudi Arabia's most powerful contractors, as part of a multi-billion-dollar expansion project. To the pilgrims below, the crane was just background machinery. To engineers, it was a sword dangling in the sky. As the storm raged, the boom began to sway. Pilgrims noticed it shifting against the black clouds. Some pointed nervously. Others kept praying, whispering that Allah would protect them. A few took out their phones to film the storm, capturing footage that would become evidence of horror. Rain whipped through the haram. Lightning flashed across the steel frame, and then came the sound, the deep groan of metal under strain. At 5:10 p.m., the unthinkable happened. With a metallic shriek that echoed through the mosque, the crane gave way. The boom tilted, gathering speed, then snapped downward like a falling tower. Worshippers looked up just in time to see the black silhouette of steel hurtling toward them. In a matter of seconds, hundreds of tons of machinery slammed into the eastern colonnade of the mosque. The impact was apocalyptic. Columns shattered like glass. The marble floor cracked. Bodies were crushed instantly under the falling boom. Those nearby were thrown into the air as debris rained down around them. Survivors described the sound as louder than thunder, a roar that drowned out even the storm itself. When the dust cleared, the sacred courtyard was filled with blood, rubble, and the twisted skeleton of the crane. The toll was devastating. At least 111 people killed and nearly 400 injured in seconds. Pilgrims who had traveled across continents for their once-in-a-lifetime journey lay dead under steel beams. Survivors stumbled barefoot through pools of water and blood, clutching prayer beads, screaming the names of family members they could not find. Children were pulled from beneath rubble, some alive, many not. Prayer rugs became stretchers as the injured were carried to waiting ambulances. The footage of the disaster spread worldwide within hours. Millions watched in disbelief as the crane's boom lay sprawled across the holiest site in Islam. Anger and grief followed. How could such a massive machine be left standing upright during a storm of this scale? Why were warnings ignored? The Saudi government moved swiftly. The bin Laden group was suspended from new contracts, and dozens of senior officials faced bans and fines. Investigations concluded that negligence had played a role. The crane should have been lowered or secured, but instead it stood tall, exposed to the storm, looming over the faithful. For the families of the victims, no punishment could repair what was lost. Husbands, wives, children, people who had saved their entire lives for this pilgrimage, never returned home. For survivors, every storm that passed over Mecca carried the memory of that day when prayer turned to panic and faith was tested by steel and rain. The crane was dismantled and removed, but the scar it left on the Haram and on the Muslim world still lingers. The disaster became not just a symbol of negligence, but a haunting reminder that even in the holiest of places, tragedy can strike without warning. Case 2. Kolkata Flyover Collapse, 2016. March 31st, 2016. Kolkata, India. Noon heat pressed down on the city. The streets under the half-built Vivekananda Road flyover were jammed with yellow taxis, rickshaws, buses, and people weaving through traffic. Vendors shouted over the noise, selling fruit and chai from carts. Above them loomed the unfinished flyover, a long stretch of steel and concrete more than 150 meters long, hanging like a shadow over one of the busiest neighborhoods in the city. Workers had been on it that morning, welding and tightening bolts, trying to make up for years of delay. To locals, it looked dangerous. Many called it the curse, but no one thought it would actually fall. At 12:32 p.m., the street erupted. Without warning, the span gave way. Thousands of tons of concrete and steel crashed down like a hammer onto the traffic below. The sound was deafening, louder than thunder, louder than an earthquake. The ground shook as cars and rickshaws were flattened instantly, crushed into metal scraps. A wall of dust and smoke shot upward, choking the air. People screamed and scattered, some frozen in shock as the flyover dropped piece by piece. For those directly below, there was no escape. Drivers had no time to react before slabs of concrete smashed through their windshields. A bus was buried in seconds, its passengers trapped inside. A fruit seller on the roadside disappeared under rubble as neighbors shouted his name. Survivors later said the sky itself seemed to fall on them. One moment they were standing in traffic, the next they were pinned in darkness, breathing dust. The rescue was chaos. Locals were the first to run forward, clawing at debris with their bare hands, pulling out anyone they could reach. Some used hammers, rods, even bricks to smash open crumpled cars. Others tied ropes around slabs and tried to drag them aside. Every few minutes, someone was pulled out alive, bloodied, coughing, crying. But just as often, lifeless bodies were lifted from the wreckage. Rescue teams soon arrived, but the narrow lanes made it impossible to bring in large cranes. Hours ticked by as families stood at the edge, calling out names, praying someone inside the rubble would answer. By nightfall, the scale was clear. At least 27 people were dead and nearly 80 injured. The street looked like a war zone. Twisted steel, smashed vehicles, slabs of concrete piled over each other, and under it all, the bodies of ordinary people who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hospitals overflowed. Families lined up outside morgues, clinging to photographs, hoping for miracles that never came. Anger spread quickly. Residents accused the construction company of cutting corners, using poor materials, and rushing the job. Officials promised investigations, but for grieving families, it was too late. The flyover meant to ease Kolkata's traffic had instead become a tomb in the heart of the city. For Kolkata, it was not just a construction accident. It was a day when progress turned into betrayal, and a city was left to carry the weight of steel and concrete in its memory. Case 3, Foshan Metro Collapse. December 1st, 2018. Foshan, China, a city of factories, neon signs, and constant movement. That morning, the streets above Line 2 of the new metro project were alive with traffic, scooters weaving between buses, cars bumper to bumper, pedestrians pressed against the sidewalks. Beneath their feet, dozens of workers labored in a half-finished tunnel. They were fighting unstable ground, soft soil, water seepage, and pressure that never seemed to stop building. Some had already noticed strange cracks and vibrations, but deadlines were tight. No one could afford to pause. At 8 a.m., sharp, the earth gave up. With no warning, the asphalt buckled and then ripped wide open. In a heartbeat, the road collapsed into a yawning black hole, stretching nearly 100 feet across and plunging several stories deep. A bus that had been honking in traffic disappeared nose first. Cars slid like toys into the abyss, metal shrieking as they smashed against each other. Pedestrians screamed and ran, but the ground chased them, cracks racing across the pavement, swallowing whole sections of sidewalk. A cloud of dust exploded upward, darkening the morning light. Witnesses swore it sounded like an earthquake, a deep roar that rattled windows blocks away. Underground, it was worse. Workers in the tunnel never had a chance. Walls folded inward. Machinery was buried instantly. Men shouted, but their voices were cut off by the avalanche of soil and concrete. Survivors later said they heard co-workers' screams fade into silence as the tunnel collapsed around them. On the surface, chaos reigned. People clawed at rubble with their bare hands, pulling survivors out of crushed cars. The sinkhole was unstable. Every few minutes, more earth slid down, dragging wreckage and bodies deeper. Rescue workers arrived quickly, lowering themselves into the pit on ropes, but each step was a gamble. Soil shifted beneath them, threatening to pull rescuers down alive. The air was thick with dust and the stench of fuel leaking from shattered vehicles. By nightfall, the toll was undeniable. At least 8 people confirmed dead, and 3 more still missing. Families crowded the site, clutching photographs, screaming the names of loved ones into the hole as if it might answer back. One mother collapsed when rescuers pulled out her son's body, covered in gray dust, still clutching the phone he had been using seconds before the collapse. Others waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the crater, knowing the truth but refusing to leave. Officials admitted later that water seepage and poor reinforcement had weakened the ground, but for grieving families, the explanation came too late. Foshan's rush toward modernity had swallowed its own people. The crater was eventually filled but the memory lingered. That street, once a place of shops and traffic, became known as the road that ate its own city. Case 4, Kep, Cambodia, 2020, 7-story site collapse. March 22, 2020, Kep, Cambodia, a coastal city known for its peaceful beaches and beautiful sunsets, far removed from the booming industrial centers of Phnom Penh. But just inland, a construction site was making progress at an alarming speed. Workers had been busy building a 7-story tower meant to be a shining example of the city's future, a new landmark. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. The workers had long known something wasn't right. The smell of fresh concrete mixed with the ever-present scent of salty sea air. In the morning, the site buzzed with energy, but the building was far from solid. There were increasing cracks in the walls, unusual vibrations that made the scaffolding rattle and hum. Rumors had started circulating about how the foundation wasn't as deep as it should have been. Still, the construction continued, pushed forward by deadlines and promises of a quick return on investment. By the afternoon, the skies had darkened. Clouds gathered overhead, and the wind began to pick up. It wasn't yet a storm, but the air was thick with moisture, and workers started to hurry to finish up. At around 3:45 p.m., the ground suddenly began to tremble beneath the workers' feet. It was as if the earth itself had begun to shift. Before anyone could react, the first scream tore through the air. The building groaned, a deep, terrifying noise. Then, in an instant, the entire structure collapsed. The 7-story tower crumbled like a house of cards, sending tons of concrete, steel beams, and scaffolding crashing to the ground. The top floors pancaked down onto the lower levels, smashing everything in their path. The sound was deafening, metal screeching, concrete splitting, and the terrible roar of the entire building folding in on itself. It was as though the ground had opened up and swallowed the tower whole. Vehicles parked on the streets beneath the construction site were crushed instantly. The roads turned into a massive jagged sinkhole, swallowing everything: cars, trucks, and even sections of sidewalk. The street itself seemed to vanish beneath the debris. The collapse was so violent that nearby buildings shook, windows rattling like they would burst, and the ground beneath people's feet cracked and buckled. Inside the wreckage, dozens of workers had been trapped under the falling debris. Concrete slabs, steel beams, and shattered glass buried them alive. Survivors later recalled hearing the desperate cries of their colleagues from beneath tons of rubble, but they could do nothing. Dust filled the air, thick as smoke, choking their lungs. Some workers scrambled to climb out, cutting their hands on metal, but others were buried before they had a chance. The rescue efforts that followed were nothing short of desperate. Locals, first responders, and construction workers who had managed to escape dug through the rubble with their bare hands, using anything they could find, from crowbars to their own hands. Crushing fatigue weighed on everyone, but there was no choice but to keep digging. Each piece of concrete they moved was like lifting the weight of the world. The ground itself seemed to fight them, shifting and cracking, threatening to swallow them alive too. By nightfall, the situation was even worse than feared. At least 15 people were confirmed dead, with many more buried under rubble, their bodies never recovered. More than 20 others were severely injured, their screams barely audible over the sound of machinery tearing through the wreckage. Families crowded at the site, their faces a mixture of disbelief, shock, and anger. Some were waiting for news of loved ones. Others, knowing the truth, searched for bodies, desperate for closure. For the next few days, the street remained cordoned off. But the devastation remained. The building had been built too fast, with corners cut, safety ignored, and structural integrity sacrificed in the name of speed and profits. The construction company, eager to push the project through, had failed to ensure proper materials, support, and even safe working conditions. Authorities later confirmed that the building's foundation was poorly designed, with insufficient reinforcement, especially at the lower levels. The collapse was inevitable. The construction company responsible was forced to shut down operations, and the government suspended the project, pending an investigation. But the damage was already done. A building meant to stand tall had instead been a tomb, and for those who had lost loved ones, nothing would ever erase the sight of the twisted metal and concrete that had once been a symbol of hope. Layer 6, Case 1, Rana Plaza Collapse, 2013. The sun had barely risen over Dhaka when the streets below Rana Plaza were already a blur of movement. The capital's bustling industrial district hummed with life as thousands of workers made their way to factories, eager to punch in and start their long shifts. Above them, the Rana Plaza building loomed tall, a patchwork of concrete, steel, and unfinished floors, an 8-story building housing 5 garment factories. Workers climbed the stairs every morning, hoping for their wages, striving for a better life. Little did they know, the building they worked in was already on the brink of collapse. The Rana Plaza building had been hastily constructed, illegally extended beyond its original design, and then packed with thousands of workers. Walls were thin, concrete was poorly mixed, and the building's structural integrity was questionable at best. The workers inside had been complaining about cracks in the walls for days. The vibrations from the heavy machines on the floors above were too much for the weakened structure. But when the building owner, Sohail Rana, threatened to fire anyone who refused to work, they returned the next day anyway. Desperation had become their reality. They had no choice but to stay. That morning, around 8 a.m., it happened. A loud crack echoed through the building, followed by a terrifying groan. The structure of the building began to bend and sway as if the concrete was trying to hold itself together. Then, without warning, the entire structure of the Rana Plaza collapsed like a falling house of cards. It wasn't a slow collapse. It was swift, deadly, and brutal. The top floors of the building, packed with workers, plummeted downward. Concrete and steel beams tore through floors, collapsing one after the other, crushing workers under thousands of tons of rubble. The sound of crumbling walls and collapsing concrete was deafening. It wasn't just the sound of a building falling, it was the sound of hope and life being wiped out in an instant. Inside, workers were trapped under rubble, their screams muffled by the weight of debris. The building was so completely destroyed that rescue teams could hardly even begin to search. The crushed bodies of workers, some still wearing their uniforms, lay scattered among broken machinery, shattered glass, and twisted metal. The collapse had cut through everything, and the chaos was unimaginable. Emergency responders arrived, but it was clear that the scale of the disaster was far greater than anyone had prepared for. By the time the dust settled, the toll was horrendous. 1,134 people were dead, and more than 2,500 were injured. Most of the victims were women, many of whom were in their 20s and 30s, simply trying to earn a living for themselves and their families. Families rushed to the scene, some hoping to find their loved ones alive, others already knowing what they would find. The sight of dead bodies lined up on the streets was haunting. The aftermath was a scene of unimaginable horror. The rescue efforts were slow due to the sheer size of the wreckage. Heavy machinery worked to clear the rubble, but it took days to find survivors. With each body that was pulled out, the grief of the families grew deeper. When investigators arrived, the extent of the corruption and negligence became clear. The building's owner, Sohail Rana, and several government officials had ignored basic safety protocols. The factory had been built illegally, with unauthorized extensions added to the structure. The owner had forced workers back into the building, despite clear warnings of structural damage, driven by a desperate need to keep the factory running. It was not just an accident, it was a preventable disaster. In the wake of the collapse, murder charges were filed against Sohail Rana and several officials, accusing them of knowingly putting lives at risk. The collapse of Rana Plaza became a symbol of the greed and corruption that had plagued Bangladesh's garment industry. Despite the charges, justice for the victims was slow, and many families waited years to see any real consequences. The disaster sparked international outrage, leading to calls for better working conditions in the global garment industry. But for the families who lost loved ones that day, the pain never faded. Rana Plaza's wreckage may have been cleared away, but the memories of the dead lingered, and the cries of the survivors echoed through the streets of Dhaka. It wasn't just the loss of workers, it was the loss of an entire community and the realization that their lives had been sacrificed for corporate greed. Case 2. Soma Coal Mine Disaster, 2014. May 13, 2014. Soma, Turkey. The morning was dark and the air was heavy. In the heart of Soma, one of Turkey's largest coal mining regions, the hum of the earth's bowels was louder than the bustle of the small town. Beneath the surface, workers were descending into a tunnel where the air was thick with dust, and the temperature always hovered near unbearable. Their bodies strained under the weight of the job, digging, lifting, and toiling in the bowels of the earth. The mine was a ticking time bomb, its conditions known to be dangerous. The ventilation system barely worked. The workers had long complained about the lack of proper safety measures, but little had been done. Overcrowded tunnels, outdated machinery, and years of neglect were the constant backdrop to their daily grind. But no one could have known just how quickly everything would go from routine to catastrophe. At 3 p.m., a sharp boom echoed through the tunnels. The ground shook violently. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Then came the suffocating rush of carbon monoxide. The gas poured through the tunnels like a tidal wave, poisoning the air and choking the life from the men working below. The fire that had ignited deep underground spread quickly, and before anyone could react, it was already too late. Workers near the ignition point fell unconscious, almost instantly. Some screamed in agony as they struggled to breathe, but their cries were muffled by the smoke and the oppressive heat. The gas moved swiftly, and many workers were left scrambling for air, desperate to escape. The toxic fumes, invisible and suffocating, clung to the air in a matter of moments. The mine had become a furnace, a tomb. When the emergency sirens finally wailed, it was too late for most. The miners in the deeper sections of the mine were left with no escape. Those closest to the surface rushed to the exits, their lungs filled with the harsh chemical sting of the poisonous gas. They made it out, but 301 didn't. They would never see the light of day again. On the surface, panic spread through the workers' families. They had no way of knowing if their loved ones were safe. For hours, they waited, frantic and helpless, as authorities struggled to figure out how to contain the fire and prevent further explosions. It wasn't until much later that the full extent of the damage became apparent. By the time the rescue operation was complete, the toll was staggering. 301 workers were confirmed dead, and hundreds more had been injured. The mine had become a graveyard. The explosion had ruptured the safety walls of the mine, which had been poorly maintained for years. The safety protocols were non-existent. There were no proper ventilation systems, and workers had long complained about the lack of safety equipment, but nothing had been done to address their concerns. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. How could something so preventable have happened? How could a company responsible for the lives of thousands of workers have ignored their safety for so long? The country was furious. Protests erupted across Turkey, demanding justice. Thousands took to the streets to mourn the loss of the workers and to call for justice for those responsible for their deaths. The company behind the mine, Soma Holding, was quickly held accountable. Executives were arrested, charged with gross negligence and reckless endangerment. The Turkish government vowed to tighten mining regulations and ensure that such a disaster would never happen again. However, for the families of the 301 workers who died that day, the reforms were too little, too late. In the aftermath, survivors who managed to crawl to safety spoke of the terror they had faced. The scars of the Soma coal mine disaster are still felt today, and the memories of those who perished are alive in the streets where their families continue to demand justice. Case 3. Upper Big Branch Coal Mine Explosion, 2010. The Upper Big Branch coal mine was a giant underground factory, digging deep into the Earth's crust for coal that powered much of the region. The men working in its shafts were used to the hazards of mining, rattling equipment, heavy machinery, and the constant threat of roof collapses or gas buildups. But what they didn't know was that they were about to walk into the most dangerous, catastrophic event in US mining history. As the miners descended into the dark depths of the mine that fateful morning, the air was heavy with the scent of coal dust, and the oppressive heat only added to the misery of their labor. They had no idea they were being sent into a ticking time bomb. For months, reports had shown troubling signs. The ventilation system was broken, methane gas levels were rising, and coal dust had accumulated in dangerous levels. But those in charge at Massey Energy, the company that owned the mine, ignored the warnings, choosing profits over safety. No one was prepared for what would come next. At 3 p.m., a loud bang echoed through the mine, shaking the ground as if the earth itself had been struck by lightning. It was the sound of methane gas igniting in an underground explosion so powerful that it was felt miles away. The shockwave of the explosion was immediate, and everything in the mine was sent into chaos. Tunnels collapsed, rocks and debris fell from the ceiling, and the mine turned into a fiery inferno. The miners who were closest to the explosion were vaporized in an instant, their bodies incinerated by the intense heat. For those further away, the flames chased them, filling the air with smoke and carbon monoxide, the silent killer. Workers ran for their lives, gasping for breath as the heat scorched their lungs and the smoke enveloped them. Some of the men couldn't see anything. The darkness and smoke were blinding, their bodies stumbling over debris, their desperate cries for help muffled by the thick air. Seconds turned into hours as workers trapped in the deep, crumbling caverns of the mine tried desperately to escape. Many didn't make it. The heat in the mine soared to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the air thick with heat and fumes. Rescue teams were sent in, but they were delayed by the unimaginable conditions. More explosions, raging fires, and the lack of proper equipment. Firefighters and rescuers were forced to retreat as the fire raged on, pushing them back time and time again. At the surface, families anxiously awaited news. Mothers, fathers, and wives gathered, clutching onto any scrap of hope, praying that their loved ones were among the lucky ones. But as the hours dragged on and the death toll mounted, their hope began to fade. At least 29 miners had been confirmed dead, but many families feared the worst, knowing that the mine's conditions were catastrophic and that the real number of victims might never be known. It took 2 days for rescuers to reach the deepest parts of the mine, and when they finally did, they found the full scope of the destruction. The mine had collapsed in on itself, completely blocking off access to certain areas. The bodies of the dead miners were pulled from the rubble, burned beyond recognition, or suffocated by the toxic gas. Survivors who were rescued were scarred physically and emotionally, some with burns so severe that their skin was melted off their bodies, others struggling with breathing problems from inhaling the toxic fumes. As the investigation began, it became clear that the explosion was not a freak accident. The mine's safety violations had been building for years: inadequate ventilation, poorly maintained equipment, and a complete lack of fire suppression systems. The company's failure to act on safety violations led to the deadliest coal mine disaster in the US in nearly 40 years. Federal and state investigations revealed that Massey Energy had routinely ignored safety protocols and that the explosion was the result of years of neglect. The company was fined millions of dollars, and multiple executives were arrested and prosecuted. Despite this, the damage was done. The explosion sparked a nationwide reckoning on mining safety, and the tragedy forced the US government to pass stronger mining regulations and oversight policies. But for the families of those lost, the reforms came too late. Their loved ones would never come back. The Upper Big Branch disaster became a symbol of the cost of corporate greed, of how the pursuit of profit could lead to preventable death and destruction.